Good afternoon, evening, or morning, wherever you may happen to be. Welcome to the Undivide Project podcast, the Changemakers edition. This is the version of our story where we uplift and amplify other voices of people who are doing the work in this fight for climate and environmental justice. And we are so excited to have Ashish Gadnis, the founder of BanQu, here with us to talk about slow fashion, sustainable supply chains, and doing our very best for those who need our help the most. Thank you so very much for joining me today.
Thank you for having me, Monica. I really appreciate the opportunity. Thank you.
And so I always like to start with an origin story. And I think, particularly for us, we work in underserved communities, overburdened, whatever name you want to call it, and with a lot of young people. And the beauty of your story is, I think a lot of the people that we work with can relate to you. So, would you like to start with just telling us where you came from and how you got started in this work?
Oh, great. So, look, I'm old, so that's a good starting point, right? So, which means I've failed more times than I've succeeded. I was born and raised in India. Grew up poor like everybody else in the late '60s, early '70s, and but was very fortunate. Got a scholarship, went to college, and then joined Tata, and then that was kind of my ticket out of poverty. Where most of the kids in the late 80s, early 90s just got into software programming, right? But fast forward, I was very lucky, came to the US, built and sold a couple of startups. At the end of 2012, I sold my last startup and was very fortunate to get an opportunity to become a volunteer in the Congo. So this is the DRC, they call it the Democratic Republic of Congo,
Yeah.
and to lead a project for USAID, and it was around smallholder farmers in extreme poverty in eastern Congo. So I spent a couple of years in and out of eastern Congo in 2013 and 2014, really trying to bring my business skills to bear in a part of the world that I didn't realize was the heart of darkness. Right? I mean, if you grew up in poverty, I feel ashamed to say that now, because compared to the fact that I had to stand in a ration line in Mumbai, compared to what I saw in Congo, I was like ultra rich, right? So I had no poverty. Seriously, just but what's interesting is that for a couple of years while we were running this project as the volunteer CEO for this rollout, and you know not only extreme poverty, but climate calamity, cholera. I mean, you just name it, right? And yet there was these amazing farmers, especially women farmers. Women are smarter than men. If you disagree, then you can jump off the podcast. But that were working. It's just a fact. That were working extremely hard, and you and I were paying, $12, $15 for a latte in New York or London, thinking it was fair trade. And I'm very honest about it. It pisses some people off. But the reality is that these women were never getting out of poverty. Yet you and I were feeling really good about it, right? And at the end of 2014, I actually got into a fight, argument, depending how you look at it, where one of the women farmers was refused a bank account. And mind you, these are extremely hardworking women farmers.
Right.
Their children forced into child labor in your cobalt mines to power your smart cars and smartphones and everything. And the local bank refused to let her open a bank account. And that's kind of the origin story for me personally. It doesn't, my origin doesn't really matter, or compared to this part is more important than my origin, because you know the fact that this mother was refused a bank account, even though she was growing your coffee, right, or cacao or
Right.
whatever, right, and the bank wouldn't trust her. And because she was a woman, which kind of didn't make any sense, that argument. She couldn't prove her harvest history, and she couldn't prove her participation in that supply chain, which shows up in a $12 latte in New York, right?
Right.
And we felt really good about it, right? And the guy said, "I cannot bank her, but I'll bank you." So that's where the name comes from, in case you're wondering. And I think it was, yeah, and it's kind of where it was less like a aha moment. It was kind of like a punch in the gut, because this is 2014, mind you, right? And the internet was everywhere. People were using mobile money. This mother had an SMS phone. She didn't have a smartphone, but she had SMS phone. In Africa, people use M-Pesa, right? And the
Right.
fact that she was not recognized for her supply chain participation in one of the most important commodities of the world, right? Coffee and cacao was a shame, right? And so, I decided not to do that anymore because I just couldn't face her. And so I came back, spent about a year traveling the world, and I realized that nobody had solved this fundamental problem. I tell people, like, if you never see me again, um, uh, recognize the problem, because everybody talks about solutions, and I think it's important to talk about problems more than solutions, because if you don't understand the problem, your solution has no meaning, right? And the problem is this, and I'll stop with this, which is that there are at least half a billion to a quarter of a billion people in the world today who live in extreme poverty as defined by the United Nations, $1.50 or whatever that is. Yet they perform the absolutely most important part of our supply chain when it comes to the t-shirt I'm wearing, or the necklace you're wearing, or the cup of coffee that you drank today, or a bottle of plastic that you think was recycled, right? And this kind of is key, right? So the audience really needs to kind of, imagine, put yourselves in the shoes of that mother who picked up the coffee today, or that mother who picked up a bottle of plastic today. Two ends of the supply chain. And that bottle of plastic is coming back as a recycled bottle, and that bag of coffee is coming in as a coffee that's grown in the Congo, right? Yet in those two examples, that woman farmer or that waste picker has no ability to prove that they are the ones who are the most important part of the supply chain beyond a measure of doubt, right? And that
Right.
is the problem that I uncovered, where how can we live in a world where the entire world is dependent on the first mile, as I call it, yet the first mile cannot prove its existence in the global supply chain. Yet today we stand at the crossroads of sustainability and say, "Oh, I'm wearing a T-shirt that's 100% ethically grown cotton." How? If you have never met the farmer, if you don't haven't seen what the farmer's income is, right? And that's the problem that needed to be solved. So let me stop there. Sorry, I didn't mean to keep going on.
No, I think you needed to go on because this is a conversation that needs to be had. And I very much thank you for sharing your origin story. And I appreciate it because I was involved with the same agency at a different point in time around figuring out how to do microloans, which is an end run around the problem that you're discussing. It's okay, we're not going to address the issue of the fact that you are invisible in the supply chain and that you're not being paid properly. We're going to give you another financial instrument that offers some relief but doesn't absolve the original issue that we're dealing with. And sometimes, to get to my next question is, it's so, why are we so afraid to confront this? Because I have watched organizations and agencies go around what we know the issue is that the fundamental question is we have to be ready to recognize the invisible people who are supporting whether we think it's ethical consumption or not, and actually allow them to participate in a way that they have opportunities. And that just seems to be such a fundamental question, but so hard to confront.
Look, I think the simple answer is, it's easy to not know, right? And I think that's kind of the way I see it, right? Why, especially in the last few years, we've suddenly woken up and grown a conscience around climate, right? So I call it the climate romance. And the easiest way to describe it is that, going back to the bottle of plastic in your hand, if it said it was 100% recycled plastic, most people in the audience feel really good about the fact that they're doing something for the climate. What they don't
Right.
recognize, is that bottle, the original, the recycled bottle, was picked up on the shores of Haiti, or was picked up at a landfill, in a place called Chunga outside of Lusaka, Zambia, by some of the most poor people in the world, who are actually the ones who are picking up the bottles that then we wake up and say, "Oh, you know what? I'm recycling. I'm using a recycled bottle, and I'm doing something with the climate, right? And I think, to answer your question bluntly, I think that's kind of the gap, right? We have found a safe spot to suddenly say we are going to save the climate, but we're still not talking about the farmer or the waste picker. And I think the other part is that if you look at supply chains, right? If you put yourself in the shoes of a large garment company, like a t-shirt company, it's easy for them to go into tier one and tier two, which is their own factory. Behind their factory is a distribution center. Behind that factory is another factory, maybe in Bangladesh. Behind that is a spinning yarn location in China. But then that's where it stops. Behind that is actually a Uyghur Muslim that's potentially being held in a prison camp growing your cotton, right? So if you say, "Hey, I am certifying this cotton as ethical cotton," the question that nobody's asking is, "Show me, prove it to me that this farmer who grew this cotton is not in slave labor or has seen an income differential go up, which then meets ethical cotton sourcing standards." And I don't think we
Right.
are yet asking that question, because we look at a label. And I was in New York last week, and I walked on Fifth Avenue and went into like six different brands, and they're all touting sustainable cotton, ethical cotton, better cotton. And I'm like, how many of you can name me five farmers? None of them can. And that's the issue.
Right. Um, and I've seen those labels, and I can't think of a one that could take me past the first tier of what you're speaking. As I'm sitting here listening to you and I'm racking my brain, in your efforts to find quote unquote sustainable fashion, and we'll get into the way that terminology is thrown around in this conversation a little bit later. For those of you who don't understand what BanQu does, explain what it is that you do.
Oh, look, I mean, BenQ is something really, I just call it simple and stupid, that nobody had done before, and people still shy away from doing, right? So it's what we do. Should have been done, 100 years ago. It just has never been done before. So here's what we do. Again, I always tell people, visualize a supply chain. It's not geeky. It's just basic, right? Put yourself in the shoes of this t-shirt company, right? That you walked in on Fifth Avenue and you purchased. So that's considered tier zero. Behind the tier zero is a tier one, which was a warehouse that t-shirt came from. Behind that is a tier two, is a factory where the t-shirt was put together. Behind that is a tier three factory, maybe in Shanghai or wherever, in Bangladesh, Turkey, where the fabric was made, the spinning and the yarn. And then tier four is the ginning. And then tier five is where the farmer has grown the cotton. This is important, right? It's like I tell people, it's less about what BenQ does. It's more about understanding how far the supply chain goes of a t-shirt that I'm wearing. So it goes up to tier five or six or seven. So what happens in tier zero, most companies will know tier one and tier two, and then the blind spot begins, right? Or the black box. And
Right.
what happens, the further you go out, the more information gets diluted, which means that at the end of the day, if there were 100 farmers that somehow were connected to this t-shirt, you have no idea who they are, because from the farmer to the co-op to the ginner to the yarn spin to the fabric to the final t-shirt, nobody really knows what is happening in that first mile. So here's what BanQu has done, right? Which is completely opposite, completely counterintuitive of what everybody else has done. What everybody else has done up until now is build systems and processes that start at tier zero, classic top down approach, and they
Mhm.
push it downstream. But the further it gets pushed downstream, it gets diluted. And by the time it gets to tier three or four, it's too late, right? Everything is commingled. We did something that nobody had ever done before. We said, wait a minute. If we're really trying to get to traceability and transparency,
Right.
there's the third leg of the stool, which is equitability, which goes to the
Mm.
origin story. And you can't be traceable and transparent without equitability, or vice versa. You can't be equitable if you don't have traceability and transparency. So what we did was we built an entire supply chain software absolutely the opposite way, by starting with the physical plot of land, and this part is key, especially now with all the new regulations in the EU, the Uyghur Forced Labor Act, and all this stuff that's coming out, is to start with the physical plot of land, a polygon as they call it, the
Mm-hmm.
farmer that grows the crop on it, and making sure that even though the farmer may not have a smartphone, and this is key, right, for the listeners, who think, wait a minute, why are we bringing all this technology to poor people and all that kind of stuff, right? First of all, I take offense when somebody says that to me, because poor people are extremely smart, right? They know how to use technology. We make the wrong assumptions. But that
Right.
aside, that farmer has an SMS phone and using BanQu. So here's what we do. We are able to help map the physical location, the polygon, the geo coordinates. The farmer gets
Right.
an SMS message in the local language that says, Mama, this is where you are, and this is where you're going to grow your crop. Cotton, coffee, cacao, doesn't matter. And when you come to sell it to the next tier, and this part is key, you will get an SMS message in your local language that confirms the price, the quality, and quantity. I've never met a mama farmer who said, please do not tell me what I sold you for what price, right? I'll,
Right.
if you met one, let me know. And everything else, if it's equal, right? I know it is not, but let's just stick with the hardcore, the dirt of it, right? Which is, that is the most important piece of the puzzle, right? Which is when that farmer or the waste picker sells the material upstream, if we can guarantee a copy of the transaction that both parties have agreed to, you for the first time created a supply chain that's not only traceable and transparent, but it's equitable because both parties have a copy of the transaction, right? And here's an example which has nothing to do with farming. If I sold you a cup of coffee right now as Monica Sanders, I have your information and you do not, because I control your data. But if we
Right.
used BanQu, the way BanQu runs on blockchain, no cryptocurrency, the way we use blockchain, you will have a copy on your SMS phone that nobody can corrupt, because that equals my copy that nobody can corrupt. And what we've done is we've broken hundreds of years of data monopoly, and we've created an equitable system that gives that farmer the ability to say, hey, I exist, and you cannot take away my right to exist. That's what we do.
Thank you. That's a brilliant description. And also, an interesting way of bringing how we can use technology to accelerate parts of the conversation around climate justice, is what I'm going to call it. And also bringing up a different way to use blockchain. Because I do think, and I love the way you said not cryptocurrency, because people, particularly in the United States, think that the two are the same. And blockchain can be used for all kinds of things: collaborative governance regimes, financial transactions. It does not have to be cryptocurrency, which, is a whole other podcast about the way that cryptocurrency weighs on underserved areas and how that manifests itself. When people are thinking, how do I verify what I'm consuming, then what you've given also is an answer on the consumer end of it as well, is a different set of questions to ask, right? In terms of, where did my t-shirt come from? Where did, my necklace or what have you comes from? What
Yes,
are
I'd add one more quick thing, right? Sorry to interrupt, but I think this is kind of where, and this, the reason why we built it this way, right? Because we never wanted to see a disconnect between human justice or rights and climate justice, right? And I think that is one of the biggest challenges we face, right? And I said this recently, is it's like, everybody thinks we're at a crossroads, right? We shouldn't be at crossroads, right? We're crossroads of making a choice between climate and people, and the answer is, it's not a choice. You have to do both,
no,
right? And the simple example is that same farmer's cotton that's moving through the supply chain, right? There is scope 3 data, there is water information, there's greenhouse gas emissions and everything, right? And if fashion companies really take a hard look at themselves and say, we can't just take the route of, hey, this t-shirt is super climate friendly because we just reduced our scope 3 emissions. Great, check that box, but that's only one side of the coin,
Right.
right? And I think what we are saying is, yes, that is important, but if you didn't factor in the supply chain participants, then yes, your scope 3 reduction will be successful. Yet that waste picker in Haiti whose plastic now is a polyester in this t-shirt, or that Uyghur farmer in China whose cotton, whose blood is in this cotton, will never ever get out of poverty.
Right. And actually, you took the question from me because where I was going with that set of examples was that we use these terms, environmental justice, climate justice, but we take the humanity out of it as though it's people versus ecosystems. And we have these binary choices without understanding that people are part of the ecosystem and that our duty to care and to take action should be equal when we're talking about both because the one is fundamentally connected to the other. Um, Whether we're talking about a farmer or a waste picker in Haiti, or if we're talking about, and I'm going to say this, sitting in one of the wealthiest counties in the United States of America, at the other end of the supply chain, that my activities inherently impact everyone down that supply chain. Every single choice that I make reverberates all the way back to that person, whether I'm aware of it or not. And it has an impact on the environment, an outsized impact on the environment by the simple fact that I'm sitting in a wealthy county in the United States. Whatever I consume has a butterfly effect around the world. Um, First, I want to talk more about your thoughts about how we make sure that we approach this from human dignity. But I came to the realization there's a couple of terms that we need to define for the audience because they probably never heard the term waste picker and don't know what
Mhm.
that is. And so, would you tell the people who are listening what a waste picker is and what that means for the rest of us?
Oh, absolutely. So look, I think in the United States, if you're actually in New York City, right? If you walk around at 2 in the morning, and I do that sometimes because I want to kind of see what waste pickers do, right? Like if this happens in the United States, it's not just happening in Indonesia and Zambia or Colombia. There are people who live in poverty who are picking up your bottles, plastic bottles, glass bottles, aluminum bottles, cardboard, and things like that, right? And in emerging markets or the global south as they call it, that is the difference between if their children are going to eat tonight or not, right? So a waste picker or an informal waste collector, right, is a man or a woman who basically is picking up stuff we throw on the streets, right? Or we toss it at the back of a restaurant. Because in a lot of countries, it's not, the waste management is still not to the level it's formal in some of the markets, like London and in the US and things like that, right? So the waste pickers are people who are really kind of walking the streets, picking up bottles and everything, bringing it to a
Mhm.
collection center, hoping to get paid. And then these collection centers are then aggregating it, bringing it to transporters. And that's where your, plastic and PET and glass and paper and cardboard, now actually electronic waste because of the shortage of, mining cobalt and things like that. That's a whole different issue. Is then collected and it goes into these massive recycling centers. It gets pelleted, flaked, and now I'm wearing a T-shirt that was made out of 10 bottles, and everybody's clapping and things like that, right? But the heart of the entire recycling economy, right, where people use throw words around like repurpose, recycle, and reuse and everything, it's all great. But about 50% of the waste that is collected, right, and I'm talking about street waste, so plastic, paper, aluminum, cardboard, glass, electronic waste, or ocean plastic, that's a big problem, is
Yeah.
picked up by human beings. And these human beings are people in poverty, and they are waste pickers, informal or formal. If they're formal, they're part of a cooperative. Informal, I mean, this is a story that came out on us, I think, this last week, where we work in South Africa with waste pickers for plastic and glass, and they're picking up stuff, and then that is now they become the farmer, right? In the same way the farmer picks up cherry for your coffee or cacao for your chocolate, the waste pickers, the heart of the circular economy. And for me, they are the most important part of the supply chain when it comes to circular packaging.
Right. Yes. Thank you for that because we think for many of us, after we put our recyclables in the bin, we really don't have a good sense of what happens to it after that, if it makes it to the bin
Correct.
in the first
And
place.
in urban places, like the truck that picks up outside of my house, that probably goes to a center and everything. But if you walk the streets of San Francisco, right, walk the streets of New York City, there's,
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I'll be there next week. I'll see it firsthand. Right? There's people actually putting their hand in garbage cans and pulling out one bottle, one can, because that is income.
Yeah. So people, when you look at that bottle and it says a 5 cent deposit, a 15 cent,
Exactly.
people try to get as many of these as they can and take it to one of those places to get the deposit money. And it's not a lot of money because another term that gets thrown around that I don't think people really grasp is when we talk about subsistence living or subsistence farming and just what that means in terms of being in extreme poverty.
Oh, absolutely. That word, right? It just breaks my heart because for the most most expensive commodities in the world, right? You walk into Switzerland, you're going to pay $40 for a bar of chocolate that's probably the size of a flashcard, right? And yet the cacao farmer in Guatemala hasn't seen a cent of a cent of a cent, 1/10 of a cent of a cent increase since 2018, right? Yet you're paying for fair trade cacao, right? And that farmer is in subsistence, and you don't have to take my word for it. Just Google it and find out what is happening to coffee and cacao farmers in Guatemala. Why are they not farming? If you are paying premium in Europe for a bar of chocolate, why are they not farming, right? And that's there lies in the answer, right? Or for example, suddenly if we all want to have circular packaging and more recycled content, right? Why are the people in a landfill called Chunga outside of Lusaka, Zambia, living in extreme poverty? And that's why, because if you look at the tiers of the supply chain, right, I'm not saying to break the profit bank of big companies. I'm not none of that. I'm just saying, because the supply chains are not traceable, the last man or woman standing in the first mile or the last mile loses out, period.
Right. And that's critical for people to know because I think as we are in good faith trying to address what we're calling climate justice at the moment, is if I pay $12 a pound for coffee, I am imagining that the person who's farming my coffee is at least getting a couple of dollars of that $12, but the
Oh,
reality of it is they're getting
yeah.
cents, if that.
Oh, if not even that, right? I mean, no chance, right? Yeah.
But that's the power of marketing plus ignorance because like you said, a
Yes.
lot of these things we can find in Google. I think the other question I wanted to ask you is, how do you choose where you're going to work next? Because there are a lot of tough places, a lot of important places to work. How do you choose where you're going to work next?
We don't, right? So like I think for us it's we're a for profit for purpose company, right? So we're very open and honest about it. We go where the brands want us to go, right? We have now we have deployed in 58 countries, so we have pretty big global reach. It's not where we decide. What we tend to do is we work with clients, right? So you can see our client list on our website. We work with clients to really understand what are the hardest parts of their supply chain, where are those hardest parts, and then we go, right? So I mean, we've never been shy of going deep where nobody has gone. So that's kind of how we. And now more than ever, there are brands who are really doing it, right? So, for all my pessimism and depressing thoughts that I've expressed so far, there is quite a few brands that we work with who kind of see the way we see the world the way we see it, and we go right. So, we're deployed in some crazy parts of the world.
Yeah, and I think I wouldn't call it depressing. I think we've been talking about difficult topics that need to be surfaced. Um, and I did look and I saw, a few, some of your clients, some of the companies that you work with. And you can say, we've been talking about the problems, but as we're coming up, a half hour goes by so quickly, especially when it's a great conversation. Talk to me about one of your positive case studies, one just at the top of mind that you think is one that people should know about and that you would be excited to see replicated or excited to see people taken to heart.
Look, I mean, I can give you a couple, right? The one that it's quite a few, but there's two or three that kind of jump out. I mean, they're all similar, just different industries, So, the one I always use is in 2018, so 5 years ago. I was standing on the Zambia Congo border with Zambia Breweries. It's a local brewery, part of AB InBev, and tough part of the world. They grow cassava. Cassava is juca, and then juca is becomes beer. And this is 2018, and we met with these farmers. We were just starting a rollout of BanQu, and incredible, right? I mean, the hardship on that part of the world was just unbelievable. And when we started adding these farmers, and met this incredible woman farmer, Ida, and this is public, so I can share the story. And I always tell the story because it is not about BenQ or us, right? It's about her, and that's more important than anything else. Is she was a recent widow, none of her children were in school, and she basically was trying to grow cassava, right? But she had an SMS phone, and that's the key. So we connected her. She started selling her cassava, started getting better income, attached mobile money. So it's not crypto, it's standard mobile money, M-Pesa. And fast forward today, right, 5 years in, Ida, all her children are in school. She actually has a home with a roof on it and sanitation. And she has saved enough money to buy an adjacent plot so that she can increase her cassava production, right? And I take no credit for that story other than all we did was connected her into a supply chain that she already existed, enabled her ability to prove her existence that she should have been given 100 years ago, um,
Right.
and and from a brand perspective, right? So this is Zambia Breweries; it's a for-profit beer company. They loved it because for them, they can prove to their customers, hey, we're buying crops from your local farmers, right? So it's not a pity play, it's not an NGO model. So I think that for me is a story that defies the odds, and it's staying power, right? So today I think it's like, I don't know how many thousands of farmers. I was in Zambia last year where what we found out was almost $27 million worth of crop had been purchased through our
Wow.
platform from smallholder farmers, right? And I think that's very dear to my heart. Right? That's one story. The other one, this one is kind of a more recent one. This just happened in the last few
Okay.
days. We've been working on it for a while, but a glass company called Ardog. Um, Glass is becoming more and more of a precious commodity because making virgin glass is really expensive because of the war
Hmm.
and cost of fuel and everything. So we rolled out with Ardog, this glass company, in South Africa, a platform that's connected to BanQu that allows thousands of waste pickers to pick up glass and then get the steady income of selling, cullet, which is, broken glass, and it goes into the supply
Yeah.
chain. And they can log in, right? So if you're a waste picker, if you have access to a computer, and a lot of people are now starting to, or a smartphone, you can log in, register, and now you can start running your micro business, and you get paid directly on your phone. Um, and that's something where I feel really good about because, again, we're just the rails, as I call it, right? We're the invisible rail that nobody should care about. All we're doing is enabling a supply chain that's traceable and transparent, which helps the brand get more profitability, but at the same time creates equitability for those in the first mile or last mile.
The supply chain. So dignity through identity, which
Yes,
there's a lot to
that's
unpack just in that tagline, which I'm sure is intentional that we could have another conversation about. um,
there's actually this, and you look. I mean, that is very intentional. And here's the easiest example. I will ask anybody in your audience listening, right? Is a very quick experiment you should do with yourself. Is think about yourself as a white man listening to this call, and get up and walk across the street and look for a car loan. Um, and you can prove your education, your work history, and your pay stubs for the last 3 years. I can bet you're going to have an amazing experience. Now put
right.
yourselves in the shoes of a black mama farmer or a black mama waste picker. Doesn't matter what continent, right? And you've been working for the last 10 years growing coffee or cacao, but you can't prove anything. All you're looking for is a small loan. And this is where I'm not a big fan of microfinance if it's not connected to supply chains, right? I
Right.
like microfinance, but if it's disconnected from supply chains, it's the interest rate is too high. So if you put yourself in that mama's shoes, and all you're looking for is a better bicycle so you can bring more crop to the buying center, no bank will treat you with any sort of dignity. They'll slap a 25% interest rate before they give you that bike, right?
Right.
Exactly.
If they accept you as a customer to begin with. And
Exactly.
it
Because
will,
right. Because for us, the dignity piece comes when you have an economic identity, right? Having an economic identity defines who you are. And if you can't prove your existence in that supply chain, you don't exist.
yeah. And the invisibility
Exactly.
cuts across all kinds of issues and ways that the communities that we're talking about and the people that we're talking about struggle to participate in the supply chain and economies in a number of the conversations that we're having. And before we go, I just wanted to flag one cultural touch point that you can help me with because I'm sitting in the United States, and as we're struggling with, when we're talking about how we call people, I just want to talk to my audience for a little bit about the term Black Mama Farmer. For those of you all who are Afro descendants, irrespective of where you come from in the diaspora, to be seen as a maternal figure, as a mother figure, is a statement of honor. It is not a derogatory term. I
Oh,
fully understand
amen.
that in the United States history of dehumanizing Black women under the Aunt Jemima and the Mammy figure, that it comes as a loaded term. But when we're using that on this podcast, and you'll hear me talk about this in other contexts, we're talking about the honorific of being seen as a leader in your community and as a maternal figure, not the dehumanizing terms that we've heard thrown around in the United States about Black women. So before any of you guys get in the comments about the Black mama,
No, in fact, I'll give you a live example actually, and this is public. I have a video on my LinkedIn on this, right? And this is going back to 2018. At the end of 2018, when we had done the initial trials, one of the mama farmers. That's why, for me, the mama farmer is the most powerful person. It's like top of the top of the top for me. And here's why, right? And that's kind of where when I say women are smarter than men, it's rooted in this example. Is at the end of 2018, one of the mama farmers came to me and said through an interpreter is that this is all good, but you need to still take care of the rats because the rats eat the money. I'm like stupid, right? So I'm like, what is she talking about, right? What kind of rats are these? And finally understood that the money was being taken away by, because it was cash at that time, by the husband or the, I don't know, cousin or whatever, right? And she said, but mobile money, which is M-Pesa, if you're listening in from Africa, you know what I'm talking about. It's just standard money. It just goes onto your SMS like a Venmo. Um,
yep,
and so we came back in 2019, and you can look at the video. I am like in utter shock because the very first transaction we did, right, same farmer, mama farmer, and she sells her crop, she gets the money on her phone, and it's SMS, right, this little phone, nothing smart about the phone, and she starts laughing. So I think she's laughing at me, right? Because people laugh at me, that's fine, no worries. But the guy says, no, 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 she's not really laughing at you, because in the milliseconds where the actual 400 or 500 kwacha got deposited on her phone, she had paid for the school fees because the school takes M-Pesa. She had paid for her solar bill, which was taking mobile money, and she didn't cash out, whereas all the men just cashed out and went drinking. And that's
Mm-hmm.
when kind of, that level of intelligence is the realization, right? And this mama rules, right? So that's when I say, that black mama farmer, to your point, absolutely, it's like and then, it doesn't, there's a Bloomberg documentary on us that was recently done, and there's this incredible mama farmer in this place called Chimborazo in Ecuador. You could see it. She's one of our amazing farmers. And you should just see her, right? She has this little SMS phone. She comes, sells her barley. She gets notification of the price, the quality, and quantity, and she rules because she now participates in the supply chain, and she's a mama farmer.
Right. And as is the inheritance of these women, she's in charge of her destiny and able to take care of her community.
Bingo. Can I
And
say one quick thing, right? And this is something that's been bugging me the last few weeks, is because, like in the fashion industry, right? There's this
Mhm.
cop out that I've been hearing lately. That I was on a call, and somebody said to me, "Yeah, you don't realize," and they didn't realize that I was born and raised in India, and they didn't realize I've spent the last 8 or 10 years of my life in Africa with farmers. But it's interesting, right? In the fashion industry, people say it's really hard to get down to the farmer level, because if you're buying cotton from 10,000 farmers in Zambia, the truck goes around and then everything comes to the ginning and you never know who the farmer is. And with all due respect, that is not true. The fashion industry has been saying that because they've been getting all this aggregated data, and then they've been saying, hey, this
Mhm.
is all certified ethical. You can get to the farmers because we have got to the farm, not in terms of tens or hundreds, but hundreds of thousands of farmers, right? So that excuse is no longer valid, that you cannot get to the first mile when it comes to fashion.
Right. And even prior to having this wonderful conversation with you, for me, that kind of argument just fails on arrival. I'm like, in this age of remote tracking, of
Yes.
Google, of all of the information that we collect on people, even if they don't have smartphones and they're unaware of it, you cannot get me to believe that we can identify someone.
Oh, and the fact that they use mobile money, right? It's like the thing that I tell people, there's zero chance, right? It's like there's people who live in extreme poverty in Kenya and Congo. And I was just in Ghana and Cote d'Ivoire, right? The poorest of the poorest use mobile money to buy two eggs, right?
Right.
So there's no excuse to say we cannot get to the last mile or first mile farmer. That's no excuse.
No. And I know from what I do in trying to help people get connected and build, community Wi-Fi, it's like I've seen kids in those places put together Raspberry Pi and get
Bingo.
on. So this, back to your point about us underestimating or refusing to acknowledge the intelligence of poor people. It's like, no, 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 they're extremely intelligent because they have to be.
Exactly.
And
And our definition of literacy, in my humble opinion, it hasn't evolved. And that's when people say, oh, when people say, well, blockchain and people, how do you think they're illiterate? I'm like, time out. First of all, they're extremely literate compared to our reference point. Second, you're actually insulting them by saying they can't handle technology like blockchain, because actually blockchain is an equalizer. It has nothing to do with code. It's an equalizer. The fact that IDA can stand up and say, I exist without depending on anybody is an equalizer.
right. And, you know, particularly when you're talking about that. It's like in many of these communities, the ethos of blockchain, which is about transparency and collaborative governance, has existed for millennia. You've just given them another language by which they can communicate it. So the idea of them not being able to handle it is a bit ridiculous, in my
Exactly.
opinion.
And this goes back to the super old. I'm really old, right? That's where we started this conversation. You probably don't. You're way too young, but I'll tell you. Like, you used to get
I'm
like
not
that.
that
Oh,
young.
There you used to get like the triplicate, right? So you had the yellow copy, you had the pink copy, you had the blue copy, and you had the white
Yeah.
copy, right? And you all four people walked off with their own copy, right? And you couldn't tamper with. That's it, right? It's crypto is an application, but this is a browser technology that there's no reason why you cannot give traceability, transparency with equity to the first or last mile.
Yeah. It's just being willing to take that step.
Exactly.
And I'm going to say, I additionally appreciate you bringing up the fashion industry because for those who are listening, you're probably going to be listening to this episode around the time that the UNGA is meeting, and we're overlapping between Paris and Milan Fashion Week, where we'll be operating in this dichotomy where on one side we'll be having these aspirational conversations about quote unquote climate justice, juxtaposed with weeks and weeks of conspicuous consumption and the last mile of the supply chain about which you speak. So, when you listen to this episode, you have an opportunity to take a step back and query some of what you'll be seeing going on around you and ask some extra questions. So, before you're tempted to go and buy that t shirt that we say is ethical or purchase from a brand, then you have an opportunity to ask some internal questions, right? And some external questions of the brands that you're operating with. So I want to say that to my audience that, you know, clearly no one here is going to be silly. We're pre-recording this episode, but the day that it's put up on your favorite podcast link and Spotify and Google and so forth and so on, you're going to be listening to it around the time that these conversations are happening. And it's intentional that we did it this way because think about fast versus slow fashion. Think about where you sit in the supply chain, per my reference about where I'm sitting, and how it trickles down or does not trickle down to other people, and what kind of questions you should be asking. Before I close out, do you want to add anything to that, Ashish?
The only thing I'd add, right? I think if even one person in the audience just really took a deep breath, got on a plane, go to Ghana or Nigeria, India, or wherever, you are going to find a landfill that has your old T-shirts in it,
Mm-hmm.
and there's poor people who are picking, not because they need clothes, right? And that's the challenge I would give you, right? The fast fashion dumping, right? Yes, you bought a T-shirt that said it was ethically sourced, and then you thought you donated it to somebody. That's a false premise because it showed up in a landfill somewhere outside of Accra and Ghana.
Yeah.
And the last question I would throw to the audience, right? If you're a CEO listening in and you're the CEO or an executive at a fashion company, right? Ask yourself a very simple question. Are you actually going to the first mile where you can personally name 5 of your cotton farmers or 5 of your plastic waste pickers and show their income for the last 3 years? Because that's what an ethical t-shirt should do. If you can't, then start.
Yeah. I love that. Thank you so
Thank,
much for joining us
thank
and for
you.
giving me so much of your time. Audience, please go to LinkedIn where you can see BanQu. You can see a lot of the great people who work there, as well as Ashish. And also, please go to the banq.com or .co, excuse me, website, and you can read some of these case studies and learn more about how they work and where they work and the accomplishments and some of the people that have been involved in this. So please check that out. And this is the Undivide Project Podcast, Changemakers Edition. And keep listening because we're going to inquire about the nature of the beauty industry. We're going to talk about packaging. I, as someone who's been involved in the humanitarian sector, is going to come back to those landfills and challenge my colleagues to think about what we're really doing when we take all of these things to different places and how can we not find ourselves in a circular pattern of contributing to the very issue that we think that we're solving. So we've got